It happened on a quiet Tuesday morning in Tallahassee, Florida. The press room was packed, reporters adjusting their cameras, murmurs bouncing off the walls, waiting for a routine update from Governor Ron DeSantis. But what came next wasn't routine at all. He stepped up to the podium, American flags behind him, security at his side. His jaw was tight, his tone sharper than usual. Then he said something no one expected. Ibrahim Traoré is a growing threat to Western interests. For a split second, the room froze. Did he just say what we think he said? Some journalists glanced at each other, confused. Others began typing furiously. But DeSantis didn't stutter. He repeated it, word for word, slow, deliberate. The clip exploded online within the hour. Hashtags like #Traoré's the West and #DeSantis speech started trending globally. Twitter lit up like wildfire. On major networks, anchors interrupted regular programming. Governor of Florida makes stunning declaration. The headline screamed. And halfway across the world, in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, journalists scrambled to the gates of the presidential palace. Microphones out, cameras ready. They waited for a response from Ibrahim Traoré. But nothing came. Not a tweet. Not a statement. Not a whisper. 24 hours passed. And that silence? It wasn't fear. It was strategy. Inside the presidential office, Traoré sat alone. The room was dim, the only light coming from a desk lamp, and a small television replaying DeSantis's press conference in a loop. His advisors waited outside, but he asked to be alone. He wasn't angry. He was calculating. He opened a drawer and pulled out an old, beat-up notebook, the one he'd kept since he was 17. Inside were ideas, warnings, and one phrase his mother had whispered to him years ago. "Son, one day the world will fear your truth." He flipped to a page titled, "Western Leverage Points in Africa." Under that, a single phrase was underlined in red ink: economic dependency. What DeSantis didn't say was more important than what he did. Because just days earlier, Traoré had signed new trade deals with China, with Russia, with fellow African nations. No IMF, no loans, no strings attached. Burkina Faso was becoming truly independent. And the old world order? It wasn't just nervous. It was scared. Traoré closed the notebook, took a deep breath, and walked to the door. "We speak tomorrow," he said to his team. But not to DeSantis. He paused. "We speak to the world." The next morning, the sun rose over Ouagadougou like it always did, but something in the air had shifted. International journalists stood outside the presidential gates, whispering theories, filming segments, desperate for a single soundbite from the man the world was now watching. But inside the palace? There was no chaos. There was quiet. Ibrahim Traoré sat at his desk, the same desk where he'd signed education reforms, wheat subsidies, and infrastructure plans. But today, he wasn't drafting policy. He was reviewing history, his own and his country's. On the television in the corner, DeSantis's face repeated over and over, a growing threat to Western interests. Traoré didn't flinch. Instead, he opened the same notebook he'd pulled out the night before. Its pages were filled with rough handwriting, ideas, warnings, and a young man's dreams. On one page, the title stood out in bold ink: Leverage and Liberation. He studied the notes beneath it. IMF loan dependency, resource extraction contracts, military partnerships with strings, Western media narratives. It was all there. Everything he had predicted. The press conference in Florida didn't surprise him. What did surprise him was how fast the world had reacted. The hashtags, the headlines, the silence from Washington, the noise from Europe, and then the silence from him. People mistook it as hesitation. But Traoré knew better. Silence creates tension, and tension draws eyes. And when the world is watching, you don't waste your words. He rose from his chair, walked to the window, and watched the city move below. Children walking to school with plastic sandals, vendors setting up stalls, a man pushing a cart of tomatoes. This was who he spoke for. Not governors, not diplomats, but the heartbeat of Burkina Faso. Outside his office, his top advisors waited anxiously. When Traoré finally opened the door, he didn't wear a suit. He wore a plain green shirt and a steady expression. "We speak tomorrow," he said calmly. "But not to DeSantis." He looked around the room, his voice lowering. "We speak to the world." That evening, a press release was quietly sent to international newsrooms. Special interview with President Ibrahim Traoré, unedited. Global broadcast. Across the globe, phones lit up. Networks made space. Time slots cleared. No one wanted to miss what he would say. But Traoré didn't prepare a speech. He prepared a moment. And when that moment came, the world wouldn't forget it. By the time the global broadcast was announced, anticipation had reached a boiling point. News anchors around the world cleared their schedules. Social media counted down the hours. In cafes from Nairobi to New York, people gathered around screens. But as the hour approached, strange things began to happen. In the main broadcast studio located in a joint facility between a Pan-African network, Al Jazeera, and RT Africa lights flickered without warning. There were sudden satellite interruptions. 2 cameramen reported being followed on their way to the studio. And then came the call. An unknown number reached the personal cell of Traoré's head bodyguard. The voice on the line was cold, clipped, and unmistakably foreign. "Cancel the interview, or risk chaos." The message wasn't a threat. It was a promise. When the security team told Traoré, his reaction was calm, almost too calm. He simply nodded and said quietly, "Let them be afraid. That's not our burden." At exactly 8 p.m., the red light on the main broadcast camera turned on. Ibrahim Traoré sat tall in a dark green jacket. Behind him, the flag of Burkina Faso. His hands were steady, his voice calm, his presence undeniable. And then he began. "They call me a threat." He paused. "Because I want my people to eat without permission, to grow without begging, to live without kneeling." The words weren't loud, but they hit like thunder. Across the continent, families huddled around radios, cell phones, old televisions. Some listened in silence. Others cried. In Senegal, a father hugged his son. In Tanzania, a woman whispered, "Finally, someone is saying it." But Traoré wasn't done. Halfway through the interview, the journalist leaned in, her voice hushed but firm. "President Traoré, why do you think Western leaders fear you?" He didn't blink. "Because I've seen what they've done," he said. "And I have proof." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a USB stick. He handed it to the producer, nodded once, and without warning, the live feed cut to raw, grainy footage. Foreign soldiers, burning fields, screaming children, a woman kneeling by a poisoned well, whispering, "They said it was for our safety." Then silence. And then the world changed. Forever. The footage aired for less than 2 minutes, but it was enough. A scorched field, a barefoot child clutching a charred ear of corn, local farmers crying, a woman whispering beside a poisoned well. They told us it was for security. The internet broke. Some viewers wept in disbelief. Others sat frozen, unable to process what they had just seen. The hashtag #TraoréTruth began trending within minutes. In WhatsApp groups, families forwarded the clip to relatives. On Twitter, the clip was reshared thousands of times per hour. Western media scrambled to contain the fallout. Some outlets called the footage unverified. Others claimed it was manipulated or out of context. But for many it didn't matter. The images had already pierced their hearts. And just when the world thought it couldn't get more raw, it did. The next morning, a Burkinabe news station aired an interview with a woman named Fatima. She sat on a wooden bench outside her village hut, wearing a faded yellow scarf. Her eyes were hollow. Her voice trembled. "My son Karim was 12, she said. He wanted to be a teacher." She took a shaky breath. "They came looking for rebels. But there were no rebels. Just children, playing football." She reached into her lap and held up a small, blood-stained school notebook. "This is the only thing I have left." The interviewer, normally composed, blinked hard to hold back tears. Fatima didn't shout. She didn't plead. She just looked into the camera and asked, "You tell mice that a threat to Western interests?" That clip spread like wildfire. In buses, on market stalls, in classrooms people watched. Some clutched their chests. Others cried openly. One YouTube comment read, "I haven't cried like this since my father passed. Traoré is fighting for mothers like her. May God protect him." And in his office, Ibrahim Traoré watched the clip, his hands clasped in front of his mouth. When Fatima held up her son's notebook, a tear slipped from his eye. He whispered softly to himself, This is why I can't back down." The world had seen numbers before. Charts, debates, statements. But now it saw a mother's pain. And once you've seen that, you can't unsee it. Just when the world expected Ibrahim Traoré to strike back with rage, he did something no one predicted. He left. No press, no convoy, no grand announcement. Just 2 guards and an old SUV. They drove past the bustling heart of Ouagadougou, down winding roads, until they reached a small orphanage on the city's outskirts. The building was cracked, the walls fading from sun and time. But inside there was life. Children ran barefoot in the dirt yard, chasing each other with laughter. A few boys sat under a neem tree, flipping through worn-out books. The moment they saw him, they froze. One little girl, maybe 7, clutched her dress and whispered, "Is that the man from television?" Traoré knelt beside her, his voice soft but steady. "I'm here because I want you to have a future. A real one." He didn't give a speech. He gave them time. Books, solar-powered tablets, bags of rice, first aid kits. But more importantly, he listened. One boy tugged on his sleeve. "Will the people who hate you come here too?" Traoré looked down, his expression shifting. "Not if I can stop them," he replied. "That's why I fight with words, not bullets." And in that moment, it became clear. This wasn't about politics. It wasn't about sanctions or speeches. It was about the children. The barefoot girl. The boy with the question. The silent hope that someone would care enough to protect their tomorrow. Later that evening, one of the orphanage staff without permission recorded a short clip. Just a few seconds of Traoré helping a boy fix the strap on his worn-out sandal. The video leaked online. Within hours, it went viral. In the comments, someone wrote, "I haven't seen a leader like this since Thomas Sankara." Across Africa, the image spread like wildfire. A president, crouched in the dirt, mending a child's shoe. No podium. No camera crew. Just humanity. And while the world argued over headlines and diplomacy on this dusty corner of Burkina Faso, a quiet revolution had already begun. A revolution not of power, but of presence. That night, long after the children had gone to sleep and the streets of Ouagadougou had quieted, Ibrahim Traoré sat alone, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Then, his encrypted phone rang. The caller ID showed nothing. Just one word. Unknown. He answered. A voice, smooth and calculated, spoke with a European accent. "Mr. Traoré, we understand emotions are high, but you've gone too far." There was a pause. "You are destabilizing the region. Withdraw your comments. Cancel the second part of your interview, or face consequences, sanctions, blockades, or worse." For a moment, there was silence on his end. Then came 5 calm words. I do not fear threats. Click. He hung up. Outside the palace, something extraordinary was unfolding. Without orders, without being asked, people had taken to the streets. Teenagers, mothers, retired teachers, shop owners, mechanics. They stood outside government buildings, holding homemade signs. We stand with Traoré. Burkina Faso is not alone. We are awake. Some held candles. Others banged pots and pans like war drums echoing into the night. There were no riots, no violence, just presence, just unity. And inside the palace, Traoré watched them from the window, his reflection faint in the glass. In that moment, he understood something deeply, something no threat could shake. This wasn't just about him anymore. This wasn't just about Burkina Faso. It was about something bigger. The mothers who had been silenced. The farmers who had been pushed aside. The children who were told they didn't matter. And ironically, it wasn't a president or a politician who lit this fire. It was a governor from Florida. But it would be Africa that decided how the fire would burn. The world was no longer watching Traoré. The world was watching the movement he represented. And the fear, it wasn't about what he might do. It was about what they might believe in. That belief, it had already taken root. And by morning, it would start to grow. 2 days after the viral interview, the headlines began to shift. Not in Africa but in Europe. A major Western news outlet ran the story. Sources confirmed sanctions being drafted against Ibrahim Traoré. The tone was cold, bureaucratic. Sanctions, frozen assets, international isolation. It sounded like standard policy language. But buried deep in the article, in a paragraph most people would miss, was one line that said everything. The proposed charges stem from Traoré's refusal to comply with IMF debt restructuring and his new trade agreements with non-NATO partners. That was it. No mention of war crimes. No accusations of corruption. His crime? Wanting financial independence. And the internet caught fire. From Mali to Madagascar, from Cape Town to Cairo, people took to the streets, not with stones or slogans, but with signs and silence. In Niger, teenagers spray-painted city walls with 4 words. If Traoré is guilty, so are we. The backlash didn't stop there. In New York City, former UN diplomat Nana Kouyaté went live on Instagram. Her tone was sharp. Her voice shook with clarity. This is not justice, she said. This is fear dressed in a suit and tie. Within 48 hours, her stream hit over 12 million views. And just like that, Traoré wasn't the only one on trial. Africa was. Western media doubled down, running op-eds filled with concern. Is Burkina Faso risking its stability? Could Traoré derail decades of international aid? But the people? They didn't flinch. Because by now, this wasn't just a news cycle. It was personal. In classrooms, students wrote essays about dignity. In barbershops, old men debated leadership. In open-air markets, women wrapped their babies in cloth printed with Traoré's face. And in a quiet village outside Bamako, one elderly woman was asked by a journalist why she supported him. She simply said, because he listens. And they fear those who listen to the poor. It wasn't about headlines anymore. It was about hearts. And the more they punished him, the more people stood up. In Johannesburg, South Africa, the sun was setting when a new video surfaced online. It wasn't flashy, no production crew, no headlines. Just a man sitting in front of a webcam. His name? Daba Mandela, grandson of the legendary Nelson Mandela. His voice was steady, but his eyes carried weight. When I see Ibrahim Traoré, he began, I see echoes of my grandfather, not because of what he says, but because of what he refuses to surrender. He paused, then leaned closer to the camera. He risks everything not for revenge, not for attention, but for something deeper, respect. The internet didn't just watch. It shook. Within hours, Daba's words were quoted across every major platform. Influencers reposted it, news anchors replayed it. And in high schools across South Africa, something remarkable began to happen. Students started printing Traoré's face on t-shirts. They chanted his name during assemblies. One 12-year-old girl wrote on a handmade poster, "I want to be brave like him." And thousands of miles away, in the US, college students gathered outside the Florida state capitol. They held signs that read, "Ron DeSantis fears hope. We don't. You can't silence truth." It wasn't a protest, it was a mirror. A reflection of a world tired of being told who its heroes should be. And for the first time, Governor DeSantis, who had ignited the storm, said nothing. No statement, no follow-up. Because by now, silence wasn't strength. It was surrender. But the world wasn't quiet. Not anymore. It had seen too much, heard too many stories, and felt something it hadn't felt in a long time. Belief. Belief that leadership could look different. That maybe justice didn't always wear a tie. That perhaps courage wasn't about commanding armies, but standing alone and still being heard. Traoré had never asked to be a symbol. He only wanted dignity for his people. But in trying to silence him, they'd done the opposite. They'd made him a voice. And now, even the youngest voices in playgrounds and city streets were starting to rise. Because sometimes, you don't need to raise your fist to lead a revolution. You just need to speak from the heart. And let the world echo it back. The United Nations General Assembly was packed that morning suits lined the marble aisles. Whispers passed like static, and translators stood ready in their glass booths. The world had waited for this moment. Ibrahim Traoré, the young president from a small West African nation, was scheduled to speak. But only for 4 minutes. He entered quietly, wearing a simple black suit. No medals, no entourage, just presence. As he stepped up to the podium, cameras clicked, lenses focused, and some delegates from powerful Western countries stood up and walked out. Stone-faced, unapologetic. But Traoré didn't flinch. He rested his hands on the podium, took a breath, and began. Africa is not a child to be raised by outsiders. A pause. A stillness. We are not a threat. We are just finally awake. In living rooms from Haiti to Harlem, people leaned closer to their screens. Traoré didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He simply spoke. If truth is dangerous, he said, then maybe lies have ruled for too long. Back home in Burkina Faso, crowds gathered in schools, markets, churches, mosques, anywhere with a radio or television. Elderly women wept. Young men stood taller. Children listened in silence, not quite understanding the words, but feeling every one of them. On a dusty street in Ouagadougou, a mango vendor whispered, "He spoke for all of us." And across the ocean, in Times Square, activists rented a billboard screen and live-streamed his entire speech. One tweet read, "He had 4 minutes. He changed everything." Because for the first time in decades, an African leader had stood before the world's most powerful room, not with fear or apologies, but with clarity. Not to ask, not to beg, but to declare that dignity was not negotiable. He didn't point fingers. He held up a mirror. And what people saw, in that reflection, wasn't just Africa. It was humanity, tired, raw, and ready to remember who it was meant to be. As Traoré stepped down from the podium, the applause came not from the room but from the world outside it. And in that moment, the message was no longer just his. It belonged to all of us. Late one night, long after the applause had faded and the headlines had moved on, Ibrahim Traoré's phone buzzed. It wasn't a minister. It wasn't a journalist. It was a retired American diplomat calling from Virginia. The voice was quiet, tired, but heavy with meaning. They're going to offer you deals, he said. Money, security, a long-term seat at the table. He paused. But they don't want your voice, they want your silence. Traoré didn't respond. He already knew. Because outside his window, children were laughing playing soccer barefoot with a deflated ball, and he realized that's who this fight was really for. He turned to his advisor. We're not doing this for approval, he said. We're doing this so no one ever steals our children's future again. And the next morning, he made a decision that shocked the world. He rejected every foreign aid package offered in the aftermath of the sanctions. Instead, he announced the creation of a Pan-African Development Fund, built by Africans, led by Africans, for Africans, scientists, farmers, economists, teachers. The people responded with more than words. Ghana, Kenya, South Africa, Senegal. Ordinary citizens sent what little they could. A farmer in Malawi gave 3 bags of maize. A single mother in Liberia sent $5 with a note. This isn't charity, it's love. Because now, it wasn't about money. It was about dignity. And Traoré had returned it to them. In a dusty school in rural Burkina Faso, a teacher read a letter aloud, written by a 9-year-old girl. President Traoré made me feel like I matter. Even if I don't have shoes. Even if I don't speak English. I matter. The room fell silent. Some of the children cried. Some of the teachers did too. And across the world, something stirred. Documentaries began airing. Poets wrote about him. Young African leaders quoted him. Even former critics whispered, "This is what leadership looks like." Then, one morning, it happened. The Nobel Peace Prize Committee announced its nomination. For defending the soul of a continent with humility and honor President Ibrahim Traoré. In Burkina Faso, the country stood still. Children screamed. Elders prayed. And in his office, Traoré didn't say a word. He just looked out the window as sunlight spilled over Ouagadougou and whispered, "Let it be for them. Not me."